Welcome to Sanctuary, bringing you conversation and stories at the intersection of life and faith. This edition of Sanctuary is produced in cooperation with the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago.
Good afternoon. I'm Nisan Chavkin, Executive Director of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago. Welcome to the August edition of Sanctuary. Homelessness is both a personal and a social calamity. It affects tens of thousands of people right here in Chicago, thousands more across Illinois. And there are misperceptions about the homeless population. For example, many people who are homeless have jobs. Many have a college education, and far too many of them are children. Joining me for a conversation about the people who experience homelessness and how we can address this dire situation in our community is the Executive Director of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, Doug Schenkelberg. Doug, it's nice to see you today.
It's great to see you
Thank you for making time to come by.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Give us a picture, if you will. What does homelessness look like here in the city of Chicago? Who are the people who are now without a place to live?
Yeah, so you can look at it from a couple different lenses. As you already noted, there's, from a statistical standpoint, we have about 86,000 people in the city of Chicago experiencing homelessness. And as you pointed out, those individuals come from all walks of life. And what we often talk about is how when people enter into homelessness, it's much more complicated than people often assume. So, as you said, like 1 in 4 of those individuals are working. 1 in 5 have a college education. Roughly 1 in 4 are kids. Half of them are families. So when we look at homelessness in our city, we're looking at more than just the person you see on the street. When we look at that total number of folks over the 80,000, the vast majority of those people aren't on the streets or aren't in the shelters, but they're living doubled up or couch surfing, which is a very common way for folks to experience homelessness in Chicago and then other cities across the nation. So they might shift from having to stay with family or friends for one night, shift to the shelter another night, find some other lodging a different night. So homelessness for them is really about housing instability, like anybody else, but it's hidden. Because you don't see them on the street in the same way.
Is that a change from how homelessness was, say, 15, 20 years ago in the city, or is this the same situation that other big cities face, like Chicago?
I think it's very similar to other cities, and it's something that we've experienced in Chicago. I think over the past few years, we've had a growing understanding of this aspect of homelessness. Okay. We do see a difference here in Chicago and in the upper Midwest, as opposed to southern cities. Places like LA, places in Florida, they're going to have a much larger percentage of their people who are experiencing homelessness on the street and outside, simply because it's easier to do from a weather standpoint than it is here in Chicago. So we do see that difference from the climate standpoint, but it's not uncommon for homelessness to manifest itself through doubled up situations.
Got it. And you mentioned that almost a quarter of our population of the homeless, or those who don't have a permanent place to stay, are kids. Yeah. Tell us, what do you know about all these children? I mean, as a fraction of the population, that must mean like every classroom in the city of Chicago has a kid who's homeless.
Yeah, so just within the Chicago public school system, we have over 18,000 kids experiencing homelessness. And as you said, it's every school. You know, some schools have larger numbers than others, right? But it's throughout the city. And it's a mix. Some of those are youth who are in families, and the whole family is experiencing homelessness. So they might be in a shelter and going to school during the day, and that's trying to figure out how they even study. And, you know, there's a huge correlation between educational achievement and housing stability. The less stability you have, the harder it is to do well in school. We also know there's a big percentage of those who are youth. And when we talk about youth and homelessness, we're talking about folks up to 24 years of age. Large percentage of them are unaccompanied youth. So they aren't with parents or guardians, they're on their own. We know that LGBTQ youth are much more likely to experience homelessness than other folks. Youth of color, people of color in general, are much more likely to experience homelessness. But everything you would think about in terms of the issues that someone would face when they're experiencing homelessness, they become that much more acute when they're young.
So as they're are there places where these young people can go? I mean, beyond couch surfing like everyone else, do we have special shelters for young people?
We do. We have a relatively good system of both day centers and overnight shelters for homeless youth in the city of Chicago. Relatively good resources for them. I say relatively because they're experiencing homelessness. They don't have housing. So that type of emergency service is critical. But it's not the sustainable solution. The sustainable solution is permanent housing for them. And that's what's going to get them permanently out of homelessness. But the emergency shelter system that we have that caters to youth, as well as the day centers that provide opportunities for them, that's a really good coordinated system. The problem is we just don't have enough permanent housing to shift folks from those temporary supports to permanent supports.
And when you talk about the barriers to permanent housing, what are we looking at? Is it finances? Is it available rooms altogether? What goes into that?
At the core, it's about we haven't dedicated enough resources to provide the support and to provide the housing for folks. So that might be in rental subsidies, so someone can get an apartment on the private market with some type of voucher. It might be building dedicated housing for people who are homeless, permanent supportive housing, buildings. It might be rehabbing. There's a lot of different ways you can go about it. But the fundamental thing is there just isn't enough funding, enough money available to provide both the housing and the social services. So it could be access to healthcare, access to mental health treatment, access to substance use treatment, job training, all these things that impact whether or not someone's experienced homelessness to begin with. Those have to come with the housing so that folks can stabilize and be safe.
I've read that Chicago has a particularly large veterans population that actually has no permanent housing. What's going on there?
So we've actually done relatively well over the past couple of years in reducing veterans' homelessness. And that's for a couple different reasons. One, coordination. So the city of Chicago, as well as other major cities across the country, have worked hard to coordinate specifically around veterans' homelessness and put in new systems in place to make it easier to find people who are veterans, to track them so you don't lose track of them in the system, and get them to housing. The bigger issue is that there was a real deep investment from the federal government in addressing veterans' homelessness. And because that money was there, it was once you identified someone who was homeless and a veteran, it was much faster to get them into housing because there was money there to cover the housing costs and the services costs. So between those two things, both improvements in the system and real investment, we've been able to have an impact. Now it's now eliminated, and one of the issues with homelessness, be it veterans or others, is we can house someone who's currently experiencing homelessness, but there's a good chance there's someone new entering the system at the same time. So it's both getting someone out of homelessness, but also how do we shut the door so people don't enter it to begin with.
Got it. Well, I think as we know that not every story necessarily ends successfully, and as you participated in this past month, we had an annual memorial observance for those who die indigent, who are buried by Cook County and who have no one really to look after them even in death. And we have a short clip coming up here of this observance, which has been held now for 34 years, in which both of us took part. And if we could just take a moment to take a look at that.
And my times. Brothers and sisters, I bid you welcome to this house of prayer for all people. But more importantly, I welcome you to our concern for the love of all persons, both in life and in death, and our desire to see wiped out the scourge of indecency and the benign neglect that permeates the atmosphere of too many quarters of our life. I thank you for being here today.
This service was first established by the late Earl Lewis in 1986 so that Chicagoans would have the opportunity to come together to honor the members of our community whose final disposition was entrusted to Cook County. May God bless and keep those who we have lost.
Let us now remember those who came before. Some of them have left a name, so that men declare their praise. And there are some who have no monument, who have perished as though they had not lived, who have become as though they had not been, with their children after them.
Life and death are inseparable. This is all in accord with nature's law, which we Zoroastrians call Asha, the natural law of order and harmony. And death is but a prelude to the greater life beyond. We wish the departed souls a life of bliss and everlasting happiness beyond.
Into your hands, O Lord, we commend our brothers and sisters. Gracious God, in whose presence live all who die in the Lord, receive those we name this day into your merciful arms and the joys of your heavenly home. May they and all the departed rest in your peace. Amen.
At the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, we work every day with people that are experiencing or have experienced homelessness. They are our partners in our efforts to break down the systems in our society that create and perpetuate homelessness. We refer to them as our leaders. They are not the homeless. They are Maxica and Derek and Adrika and Charles and Catherine and Kelly and Gloria and Myron and Elgina and Tom and Mark and Tim and Sinovia. They are not the homeless. They are our friends.
David Mart, Kit Ormsby, Alfred Salesi,
Antonio Garcia, Bella Boker, Pablo Acevedo,
John Henson, San Juan Huepitak, James Carpenter, Antonio Villas Garbe, Douglas Whitaker, Sharice Hancox, Lloyd Lunar, Anthony B. England.
I'm here with Doug Schenkelberg, the Executive Director of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and that was a very powerful experience that we had. It's something we do every year, and every year it's a privilege, but it's a somber privilege to say all the names of all of our fellow citizens who literally had no one to bury them and who were buried by Cook County. And I think in your tribute as well, picking up on that, each of them has a name and deserves to be remembered. And I think about that observance, and I think about it as we go into the summertime, particularly now. It's the warm part of the year. A lot of us really don't. Homelessness picks up a lot of popular energy. People get Thanksgiving baskets for people. They fill their coffers with the Salvation Army. They do their work through the holiday season. But homelessness is not a periodic problem. It runs through the year. What is some of the issues that people who are experiencing homelessness have to deal with when it's summertime and it's so hot outside?
Yeah, so what we say is homelessness is a 365-day-a-year issue. And you're right, some folks see it in the winter and there's a heightened awareness about it. Sitting here today, we know that there's an excessive heat warning coming over the next couple days. And so, individuals who are experiencing homelessness on the street are going to be dealing with extreme weather conditions, right? So, the ability to get inside, the ability to access cooling centers, to be safe in this weather, which is something that we all need to do, right, when there's extreme weather, but it's so much more acute for someone who's experiencing homelessness because of other compounding issues that they might be dealing with, whether it be chronic health issues, mental health issues, things of that ilk, and just the fact that they don't have a place to call their own, right? And what we try to stress with folks is homelessness is never easy. A beautiful spring day doesn't make homelessness easy. There's those issues that you're dealing with because of lack of housing stability are still there. You might not have to worry about the weather that day, but there's a lot of other stuff you have to worry about. And so we try to raise people's awareness about the fact that, we want to address homelessness before that extreme weather comes and get people to permanent housing before that, and not just think about it when there's a particularly acute situation.
So you're talking about some of the work that you do as part of heading the coalition. What is the coalition exactly, and what are the services that are you providing services? Are you raising awareness? Are you working for policy? Tell us more.
So the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless has been around since 1980, so we're on the verge of our 40th anniversary. We focus primarily on improving systems, whether it be better funding or better policy that addresses homelessness, whether it's in the city of Chicago or the state of Illinois. So we work in Springfield, we work in City Hall to get our elected officials to focus on the issue, to put real change in place around that. And we do it through community organizing. So we engage with individuals who have experienced homelessness or are experiencing homelessness. They are the ones who drive the ideas and the policy changes that we want to move, and they are our partners in advocating for those changes. So they speak with the legislators, they engage with them to share their stories about what homelessness meant to them and where they are now, and to share why this policy change, why this funding change would have an impact on their lives. In addition to that work, we provide legal support to folks experiencing homelessness. So be it, we have a mobile legal clinic that goes to the youth shelters that we already talked about to provide legal services primarily to homeless youth, but not exclusively. We also work within the Chicago public school system to provide legal representation to families and youth who aren't being afforded their educational rights that people who are homeless should be afforded. And so that legal work also helps us see some of the systems issues that we can then translate to policy change on the city and state level.
That's exciting. So you're not actually operating shelters?
No, we don't operate shelters. We work really closely with the homeless service provider system, and they're our partners in the advocacy work, and they let us know, as our leaders do, the folks who experience homelessness, what they're seeing and what can make their systems work better, and then we provide the backbone for the advocacy work to make those systems better.
Got it. So you talked about some of the key policy changes. Are there things that are in a city and a state that's looking at financial challenges, you could say? Are there some changes that we can make structurally that just make better sense and make things work more smoothly, not necessarily for an exorbitant cost or a significant investment?
So one thing that works incredibly well and is, in the scheme of things, is relatively affordable is homelessness prevention. So we have a program at the state level that provides assistance to folks who are on the verge of becoming homeless, be it they have an eviction notice, they are behind in their mortgage payments. It might be because of a health crisis, it might be because they lost their job, but it's much cheaper to keep them in that home and help them stay stable through that crisis than have them enter the system. It's going to cost a lot more to get them out of homelessness. So that in and of itself, and I referenced earlier about how do we kind of shut that door of people entering into homelessness, a robust prevention system can do wonders. And we know that it's an incredibly successful model. And Catholic Charities is one of the organizations that administers that program here in the city of Chicago, and they've seen incredible success with keeping people in their housing through that funding stream. So that's just one real useful, successful model that broadly isn't as expensive as getting people out of homelessness and having to provide new housing for them and new services.
Right. And if someone's on the edge like that, how do they tap into that system? How does someone like Catholic Charities know whom to help?
So the standard way is through Chicago's 311 system. So we call 311, let them know your situation. They'll channel you to the right provider who can help you get access to that support. Obviously, with this program, like any other program, there's certain rules and parameters about qualifications for it, but they'll walk folks through that if they.
So it's part of that new 311 app that they're advertising now. So I can
use
tap
that
in
as well.
So that's a very exciting resource that the city provides and coordinates with private organizations to be able to keep people in their homes. That sounds like a really good innovation. Is Chicago kind of a leader in that, or is other
We
places
are.
do that?
Yeah, I mean,
something to be proud of.
It is something to be proud of,
Good.
And there's state funding that is used for the program that goes around the state, and obviously a good piece of it comes to the city of Chicago, and we've been working really hard to increase that funding at the state level so more folks can be served, and also do some revisions to the policy so that it meets people where they're at. It doesn't have some arbitrary cutoffs that don't actually reflect the needs of individuals. But we know that a lot of other states, this program's been around, I want to say about 20 years, and we were, along with other coalition partners, some of the first advocates for this to be set up. And we know other states around the country have adopted this model and have seen similar success.
That's great. We'll take a break for a moment and we'll be right back. Please stick around and we'll just take a short break.
Metropolitan Chicago is one of the most religiously diverse areas in the world, and for more than a half-century, Sanctuary has reported and reflected on our faith-filled community. Sanctuary tells stories of faith from both inside our houses of worship to the streets and neighborhoods where faith is acted out every day with acts of kindness and concern. From food pantries to peace initiatives, from worship services to servicing the poor, Sanctuary has a proud history of reporting on the goodness that flows from our faith traditions. Watch Sanctuary every Sunday at 12 noon on the Live Well Network.
Welcome back to the August edition of Sanctuary. I'm Nisan Chavkin, here with Doug Schenkelberg of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. Doug, we were talking about some of the things that the city does well and trying to address and meet the needs of people where they are when they're facing home insecurity or actually homeless. And are there things that we can do as a city policy-wise that will require an investment but are sort of penny-wise and yield greater dividends as we go, rather than just sort of chipping at the edges and just always reacting to the problem? What's some changes that your organization and other advocates for people facing housing insecurity are pushing for?
Yeah. So what we always say is that the reasons people enter into homelessness are more complicated than people assume, and the solution to homelessness is simpler than people assume. The solution is permanent housing with supports, period. It's an effective model, what's referred to as housing first. So you provide people housing immediately. You don't set conditions upon it. You don't say that they have to get a job, say that they have to be clean. You get them into housing, and then you can address the issues that they're dealing with, because it's a lot easier to address those issues when people are in a permanent home. And so our issue isn't what's the solution. Our issue is there adequate funding to do it, and is there political will to put that funding in place? With 86,000 people in the city of Chicago, we need a solution that's at a scale that matches the size of the problem. And we can totally do it if there is the will to do it. So what we've been working on is a campaign called Bring Chicago Home, which is really focused on putting in place a new revenue stream that's dedicated to addressing homelessness in the city of Chicago. And if we can do that and generate new money, we can reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness. That number of 86,000 will go down by over 30,000 in the first 10 years alone, simply because of that investment. So what folks can do is learn about the campaign, get involved with the campaign to really push for this kind of fundamental systems change, so that while we continue to provide emergency services, we come up with a much more fundamental solution to the problem.
Right, so you're going to cover prevention as well as intervention and sort of last-minute or emergency case sort of circumstances, which are always more expensive than the investment on the front end. Tell us, where does this revenue stream just come from in 30 seconds or so?
Yeah, so what we're proposing is an increase in something called the real estate transfer tax, which is a tax that's paid when you buy or sell property. And that would be a tax that would go on properties of a higher value. So there wouldn't be an increase on lower value properties. And if what we propose were to go through, it would generate about $150 million in new revenue.
Wow, that's very exciting. Other communities use this system. I think Evanston does it. Are there other ones that are doing it?
Yeah, so this tax exists throughout the state of Illinois in different municipalities. And on the state level, there's a state level tax that goes to funding affordable housing as well. So this is not a new
So this is a doable thing.
It's definitely a doable thing. And the thing is, we're already spending this money. We're spending this money through the justice system. We're spending this money through emergency health care. This money is going out from the government already. It's just not doing it in a way that's efficient and good for the individuals who need the help. So this is a much smarter way for government to spend money on addressing homelessness than the reactionary way we spend it now.
Got it. Now, that makes a lot of sense on policy grounds and working with public institutions. But as individuals or communities of faith, what kind of steps are move us beyond just bless the Salvation Army and their collection effort? Right. It's wonderful, but is there more that we can do than just putting it in the kettle come Christmas time?
Yeah, and as you well know, faith community congregations are often some of the first to step up to help. Whether they're running a soup kitchen, whether they're running overnight shelter in their basement, we see that over and over again. They are acutely aware of homelessness and want to give back and help folks in that situation. What they can do as a next step is think about what are the systems that are causing them to have that emergency response. Right? Why is it that someone has to come every day to get a free meal or has to sleep in their basement? And how do they use that understanding about the problem and the underlying problem to talk to the legislator that is, or the alderman that their congregation is represented by, and lets them know that while they're doing their part to serve individuals on a daily basis, they want to see our elected officials do more to reduce the number of people that they have to serve. And give them the housing that they need. So they can really use their voice and really talk from a point of what really is the right thing to do, a point of the need for real fundamental solutions.
Well, that's an exciting step. I know that so many of the churches and synagogues and mosques and temples and organizations across the city are doing this kind of frontline work. And are really interested in more than Band-Aids in primary care. They are interested in preventing and reducing this challenge, and I think you've marked out for us a very useful set of steps that we can take those voices and hear the voices of people who are facing it and dealing with the implications of homelessness in their current communities and their congregations. Doug, you've given us some really good options, both for policy and for individual and community action. If people are looking for more resources or want to support the coalition, how do they get in contact with you?
So the best way to do it is to go to our website, which is chicagohomeless.org. There they can read more about our work, about our campaign, Bring Chicago Home, how to get involved, connect to us through social media, and just learn more about the situation.
Great. And if someone has reservations about contacting the city or whatever, but they're facing homelessness or worried about it, can you help them?
Absolutely. So they can give us a ring. We can direct them to the right resources. If they need legal assistance, we might be able to help them out as well.
Terrific. Doug, thanks so much for coming by. I want to thank again Doug Schenkelberg, the Executive Director of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, for stopping by and talking with us about this pressing issue today. On behalf of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago, I'm Nisan Chavkin, and thank you so much for watching Sanctuary today.